On December 24th, 1929, President Herbert Hoover and his wife Lou were holding a Christmas party. In attendance were several young children of his secretaries. The president was enjoying the festivities when a message was passed to him. He and his secretaries were urgently needed. In fact, rarely in history has a crisis so immediately demanded the attention of the chief executive. Christmas Eve at the White House in 1929 deserves to be remembered. For a century, the staff of the president worked on the second floor of the president's mansion, sharing space with the residence of the president and his family. This created problems in the 19th century as the quarters became quite cramped. The website of the White House, whitehouse.gov, explains various proposals were put forward during the late 19th century to significantly expand the president's house or build an entirely new residence, but these plans were never realized. Strangely, the issue would be pressed owing to an assassin's bullet. The assassination of President William McKinley in 1901 brought to the executive mansion Theodore Roosevelt and his family of 6 children. There simply was not room for the president's family and staff. In 1902, the president had a staff of 30 in the existing residence. Roosevelt made many changes to the White House and a renovation that cost $500,000. Among the most drastic alterations was to move the offices of the president's staff out of the residence and into a nearby and newly constructed temporary executive office building, placed on the west end of the West Terrace. The building was some 100 feet from the residence, connected by a colonnade. The Kansas City Star wrote in 1902 that President Roosevelt and his clerks and stenographers had installed themselves in the building until more pretentious quarters could be built. To the president's dismay, the new structure required the removal of the White House Conservatory, a massive and lovely greenhouse complex that included 2 rose houses, a camellia house, a grapery, a fern house, a geranium house, an orchid house, and a propagating house. In its original design, the president's office stayed in the main building, but the offices of his secretaries were moved. The building was not well regarded, sometimes called the Wart and the White House Barn. It would be some decades before it became regularly known as the West Wing. The White House Historical Association notes that members of Congress often refused to meet with the president in the new building, and Roosevelt still conducted much of his official work in his office. In 1909, Congress appropriated $50,000 to remodel the building, both for better aesthetics and more practical purpose. This renovation, during the administration of William Howard Taft, doubled the size of the executive office building. The new addition created an office for the president along the central axis of the building. Designed by architect Nathan Wyeth, the president's office was an oval shape, to match the famous Blue Room in the main building. In 1929, Herbert Hoover had renovated the floor plan to accommodate a larger staff. The Kansas City Times reported that Hoover found the arrangement of the executive offices unbusinesslike. The 3-month renovation allowed for the Times notes more commodious, agreeable, and better working quarters. At the time, the executive office building contained the office of the president, the cabinet office, a reception room, the offices of his 3 secretaries, and a press room on the ground floor, with room for the White House Corps of stenographers and quarters for the Secret Service in the basement. There was another half-story attic on top which stored government papers. The Associated Press noted, through the executive offices, thousands of tourists have passed each week. 1929 was a difficult year. The stock market crash between September and November had wiped out some $14 billion in stock value, ushering in the worldwide Great Depression. The nation was facing an uncertain future at Christmas time, 1929. On Christmas Eve, the Hoovers were hosting a Christmas party in the White House residence. In attendance were 8 children, the young sons and daughter of the president's secretaries and personal physician. The Marine Corps band was playing Christmas carols in the hall. The Tampa Bay Tribune reported, the state dining room with its great chandelier was ashimmer with silver, shining through the red and green of the Christmas decorations which completely covered the Christmas tree. Opposite the tree sat a happy president, talking alternatively to Suzanne Boone, age 9, on his right, and Charles Ackerson, age 7, on his left. Erwin Ike Hoover entered the room. Hoover, no relation to the president, had been chief usher at the White House since 1909. He whispered in the president's ear, "The executive office is on fire. I want you to get your secretaries away from the table." His face instantly altered expression, the Times reported. All the men withdrew. The Wichita Eagle reported that the telephone operator had first noticed smoke coming from the upper half story of the executive office and called in the alarm. Russell Wood, a Secret Service man, had called the White House proper, and an operator there rang the fire department. Wood and other agents then tried to fight the fire themselves. The St. Cloud, Minnesota Times reported that Mr. Hoover had feared the outbreak of a fire at the White House, and at his direction, the number of hand extinguishers was increased. Unfortunately, the paper wrote, the blaze was of such proportions, however, that these were inadequate to quell it. Meanwhile, the president, his secretaries, who were in attendance at the party, and the president's son, Alan Hoover, a student at Harvard University home visiting for the holidays, moved to rescue important documents from the president's office. The Reno, Nevada Gazette-Journal reported that, summoned from the dinner table, Mr. Hoover was among the first to reach the west wing of the White House after the alarm was sounded. Not heeding the smoke, which had begun to eddy thickly, he went into his office and began to carry out furnishings and documents. He was persuaded to leave the room with difficulty, and even then, he stood outside and aided others that were carrying out valuables. The Eagle reported that George Ackerson and Lawrence Richley, two of the president's secretaries, with Alan Hoover, carried the drawers of the president's desk from the smoke-filled building. The body of the desk, however, a large mahogany pedestal desk that had been ordered as part of the renovation under the Roosevelt administration, was too big to pass through the window. A quick-thinking Ike Hoover used a tarpaulin that was intended to be used as an awning at the New Year's Eve reception to protect the desk from water damage. But finally, only the firemen with masks could penetrate the dense smoke, and hope was abandoned for some important records. A fireman named Fred C. Stein pushed into the smoke and water-filled building and brought out safely the president's flag. The Gazette-Journal reported that all of the city fire apparatus in the central section of the Capitol responded to the alarm, including 19 engines and 4 truck companies. The Eagle wrote that at 9:40 p.m., smoke was still pouring out of the windows and the roof. Firemen inside the building were ripping into the walls, and 50 or more firemen were trying to uncover the blaze from the roof. The Gazette-Journal noted that the firemen encountered many difficulties in battling the blaze. The metal gratings at the ventilators had to be torn away, and then boxings of stout pine inside had to be broken through before water could be applied to the flames. The Eagle reported that the hoses had been run from every available hydrant, and water was being pumped into the building from between 25 and 30 nozzles. At times, a fireman pulled loose a piece of roof, and flames leapt skyward. The outside walls above every window were blackened by flames and smoke. Dozens of fire engines jammed Pennsylvania Avenue and the side streets surrounding the structure. In addition, the Gazette-Journal writes, the weather was bitterly cold, and a coating of sheer ice lay wherever water had fallen. The forming on the rungs of the ladders made for difficulty in getting nozzles to the effective points. Of course, a 4-alarm fire at the White House drew attention. The Eagle reported that the crowd that gathered about the grounds was augmented minute by minute, partially from groups leaving a Christmas tree, which the president had lighted nearby earlier in the evening. Hundreds of watchers were kept from the White House grounds by the police. Meanwhile, Lou Hoover had stayed with the children. The Tribune writes that Mrs. Hoover, mistress of many emergencies, including the Boxer Rebellion in China, carried the party onto its close in a manner gracious and serene. The band played on and on at her request as the children transitioned from the dining room to the East Room. Then Mrs. Hoover disappeared, and when she returned, it was to call the children around her. She explained to them that when their daddies left, they had to go because their offices were on fire. She asked the children if they'd like to go to the second story and see the smoke. Would they? 8 pairs of scampering feet were the answer. Through the poise and thoughtfulness of Mrs. Herbert Hoover, who has seen her historical events and values them, 8 unfrightened children will always be able to say, I watched from a White House window, the White House fire of Christmas Eve, 1929. At 10:35, the Times reports the fire was pronounced under control, and 20 minutes later, the firemen said it had been extinguished. 2 firemen had been injured, one with burns to his face from a backdraft and another overcome with smoke, who had to spend the night in a hospital. The Eagle described the building as a total loss and wrote that the entire lower floor was filled with water. The Gazette-Journal reported that Lieutenant Colonel U.S. Grant III, grandson of the former president and in charge of public buildings, said that the roof, ceiling, floors, and partitions would all have to be replaced. The Associated Press noted the sorry state of the president's office. The walls were stripped of all decorations, and only the desk used by the president remained of the little furniture usually there. It stood almost in the plumb center of the room, bereft of drawers and its surface completely empty. The windows had been robbed of their draperies. A solitary chair stood forlornly in one corner, water dripping from the ceiling. The floors were bare of rugs. All in all, the room appeared to be that of an apartment for rent, and apparently with little chance for receiving a tenant because of the waterfall and the consequent blemishing of the walls. The Gazette-Journal noted that in addition to the cost of reconstructing the building, There had to be reckoned in the value of files and other less tangible things lost. But not all was lost. The Times reported that all of the president's valuable confidential files were safely moved beyond the reach of the flames. Today, they were housed in the building usually devoted to the White House florist, closely guarded by soldiers. And the Eagle noted that the big green clock in the president's own office, which has kept time for a number of chief executives, was saved from the flames, largely because the office was the last to burn and a fireman was able to carry it out. It is resting comfortably in a big flower basket in the florist's room. It was not conclusively determined what had caused the fire, either an electrical short or a block flue from a fireplace, but in any case, the fire had quickly spread among piles of documents, most of them various government leaflets, some as much as 50 years old, that had been stored in the attic. Newspapers at the time noted that the Christmas Eve fire of 1929 was the worst fire to strike the White House since 1814, when the British burned it as part of the War of 1812. And it's hard not to see the symbolism of the White House executive office burning to the ground on Christmas Eve in the disastrous year 1929. Certainly felt like it was a portent of things to come. And of course, there is some irony in the fact that the executive offices were done in by the piles of outdated propaganda that they had left in their attic. The building was uninsured, and a special appropriation had to be made for the reconstruction. A contract was awarded in January, and the new building was completed by mid-April. The desk that Ike Hoover's tarp had saved is known today as the Roosevelt desk. It was brought back to the White House and used by President Truman, famously sporting a sign that said, "The buck stops here." Since 1963, the desk has served as the desk of the vice president. Maybe there's also some symbolism in the fact that the vice president's desk has survived a fire? But in the end, maybe the best message to take from the Christmas Eve White House fire of 1929 was the one that was taken by the children that attended the Christmas party. The Tampa Bay Tribune noted that viewing the fire from the second floor of the White House was the finale of the Christmas Eve party for the young guests. A short time later, they were courting sleep in order to hasten the advent of Christmas Day and attendant joys. That is to say that even with the fire, Christmas came nonetheless. From everyone here at the History Guy, have a very Merry Christmas.
We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. The tidings we bring to you and your kid. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Now bring us some figgy pudding. Now bring us some figgy pudding. Now bring us some figgy pudding.
I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.